Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, lots of thumbs up. And I should probably just say at the outset that if you hear any kind of shrieks in the background, that's my toddler downstairs just going to bed. And it's nothing to do with anything suspicious going on. I don't know what you've heard about how we live down here in South London, but there's nothing weird going on. It's just normal parenting, which I've, thanks to this fantastic session, excused myself from for one evening. So thank you for that, everyone, and thank you for having me. So how does change happen? It's a terrifyingly big brief and a huge amount to try and cover in 15 minutes. So I'm hoping that we'll have a really productive conversation afterwards when we have a bit of a kind of a Q&A or a discussion later. Just a quick note about myself, and maybe to give a sense of why Pete and the team asked me to come in and speak to you about this stuff. So I started out in academia, got my PhD, and then got into what we call the policy world or the think tank world. So I currently work for a think tank full time, a Westminster-based think tank, if you like, but one that looks outward. It's much more to do with localism and regionalism and how things are dealt with and governed locally. It's an organization called New Local. And the question, how does change happen? How do we make change happen? How do we make influence happen? That's a question that people with my kind of job ask ourselves every single day. It's a real preoccupation for people in roles like mine, because it goes to the heart of what we do with our time every day. What should we be spending our time arguing for? What should we be taking as our approach or our method that we think will be most persuasive? What's the lever that I can pull? What's the button that I can push that will make some decision maker somewhere in the system make something change, or even persuade a large group of the general public to shift their mindset or to behave differently, to achieve some outcome or to do something differently? These are really difficult questions to figure out. It's a really complex world. But what I want to do in my kind of quick kind of initial chat here is sort of make the case for three arguments or messages which come directly from my own research, and I think speak to the kind of the scale of what you're doing here in your citizens' work. So number one, big problems can very often have local solutions, at least in part. And I think that's a little bit, that I think is not a kind of an automatic one for everyone to kind of jump to, because many big problems feel like if it's a global challenge, if it's an international challenge like climate change, like the way the weather works, if you like, over hundreds of years, it feels like the things that we do at a local scale might not have any purchase, might not get us going in the direction we want to. But actually, the research shows that many big problems, and climate change is a really good example, are actually easier to at least start to shift or to address at a local scale and at smaller scales. So I'm going to try and explain why that might be, why that sort of counterintuitive, that surprising idea is true.
Off me. Get off my knee.
Oh, someone's jumped on someone's knee. Never mind. Number two, the way that change happens in a bottom-up way only ever occurs when enough pressure is exerted at that local scale, when enough examples are set by people doing things differently where they are, when lots of people with a shared perspective in their particular places start to apply pressure from the bottom up. There are lots of different ways that change can happen from the top down, but from the bottom up, you really do need to make a difference all together in a collective way. And number three, and this might be the most important bit for the purposes of your question, which is how to make change happen. You really do, maybe this is obvious, you really do need to start by knowing what specifically you want to change, what your objective is. And let me add a little proviso, a little rider to that. Not only what the ideal might be, not only what you really want to see have happen, but what, given realistic constraints, given the real world of pragmatism and reality that we all live in, what can change and what can be achieved given those constraints. And that's a really tricky way to think, because I think we're all trained to think in ideal terms and we're encouraged to think in ideal terms, but policy, and I suppose you are all now in the same business as me, it comes to policy recommendations at a certain point, is all about the real world. It's all about the art of the possible, as someone once said. So those are kind of my three big arguments. But let me start in a slightly different place, which is sort of the three kinds of words or levers that we tend to think of when we think about making change happen in our system. Three words beginning with the letter P, conveniently, and those are power, politics, and policy. And I think the reality is that in everyday terms, and I do this as often as anyone else, we tend to use those three words interchangeably, but they are quite different words, and I think they might help us to kind of think through what it means to make change happen. So the big question when we think about power, at least in academic and policy terms, is who has it? What's the distribution of power? Who has more of it? Who has less of it, and why? Can it be moved? Can someone who has less of it now have more of it a bit later on? And in our system, we have a kind of a paradox. We have power extremely concentrated in one sense, but very widely distributed and shared in another. So what do I mean by that? Well, we live in one of the most centralized countries in the world, in economic terms, in cultural terms, in political terms, one of the most centralized countries in the world. And I just said that local action is really important. So there's your contradiction. We also live in a democracy, and we also live in a market economy. So when businesses and governments do things, they seem to do it arbitrarily, and they seem to be able to exercise their power without any real check. But actually, in a democratic system, which is what we live in, if enough people contradict that, they can hold the government accountable. And in a market economy, if enough people don't like the way a business behaves, even a business with quite a lot of influence in a certain area, they can change their habits, change their behaviors, change their spending decisions, and have an impact on a business as well. So we have concentrated power with loads of lines of accountability feeding out, and tracing out those lines of accountability is a really, really important way of figuring out how to make change happen. The other context for this, of course, is the local authority, the council, an important player in what you're all thinking about and talking about here when it comes to climate change at your local level. Does a council have power? They have a bit of power, not relative to the centre, as I just said. It's a very centralised country. But what about within the council? Do councillors have more power or officers? Officers are like the civil servants. They're the people who do the technical work of enacting policy change and getting things done. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But the councillors ultimately are the ones who are democratic representatives. They're the people who you vote for in a local election. They're there with a mandate, as we say. So the interaction between those varies from place to place. And understanding what we might recommend to those two different categories of people is also an important part of what we might want to talk about. So that's already gotten us in our conversation about power and who has it to these other two P words. So politics is that question about who gets to have power, the process by which we decide who gets power. That we could just summarize politics in that way. And policy is the plans that those people with power then go on and try to implement. Now, I think given those three words, we can actually just set out what I think is the traditional model of how people attempt to achieve change in this country, if they do indeed try to do so. So here's the standard model of trying to make change happen as just an ordinary person who isn't a member of any of these special groups. A normal person gets to influence power via the political process, and sometimes they get to impact policymaking through, say, a consultation, or through a process like the one you're engaged in. But as you know, these are really rare, and it would have been much easier not to be involved in this than to be involved in it. So it's brilliant that you are involved, but you're actually presented with an opportunity now that most people never get. So you get to vote, you get to protest, you get to do the occasional consultation, you talk to either the local or the national government, and maybe you change your spending habits. Those are all the levers, those are all the buttons that are available to the normal person. That's the traditional model for changing things. And in reality, most people never change things through those processes. An individual vote doesn't get you very far unless you're working with others. An individual spending decision to change which business you decide to procure something from or buy something from doesn't change much unless everyone else does the same thing with you. So working collectively and working deliberatively, having conversations like these, is the way we magnify individual power at that baseline level. And I think that's an important way to think about that. And this is also where the idea of scale and local action becomes important again. Because as I said at the beginning, sometimes these big global issues are much more easy to address at a local scale, a small scale. There's a very famous saying, which is that all politics is local, but the reality is that all policy is local too. Now, before I tell you why I think that, here's just a handful of issues that I'm aware of, having done really literally 10 minutes of research and talking to some friends who don't live very far away from where you all live, about what's going on near you that's relevant to the questions of policy in climate change. Local public transport, I'm told, and someone here might well want to disagree with me later on, isn't the best and could be much better where you live. Local public transport therefore has an impact on the way that people use cars and the extent to which people make individual emissions contributions. And it's also a network that can either be resilient or vulnerable to the effects of climate change as well. So there's 3 or 4 ways that transport policy locally, and this is something that really can be influenced at the local level and by councils, are relevant to climate change and to climate change policy. How resilient is your railway connection to extreme weather events, your road connections and buses to flooding, to storms like the one that we're getting battered by today? Relatedly, coastal erosion. You might already know this already from one of your previous talks. So coastal erosion is a process that's completely natural, but most scientists agree that it's exacerbated by storms and heavy seas that scientists say are made much more common by climate change, by the effects of climate change. And I found out while doing this research that the whole of your area is actually in the UK's top 5 most vulnerable areas to coastal erosion. So that's something that's incredibly relevant where you are. And that's something where, and believe me, this is the kind of decision and the kind of investment and the kind of shift that will have to happen at a local scale. That's where resilience will come in, at that local scale. If you care about the coastal erosion question, or whether you want to connect it to the climate change policy area, that's something that could be on your business agenda. Barrow Port, as I'm sure you know much better than me, is the primary connecting point and servicing point for the Walney offshore wind farm. That's not just a big wind farm, that's the biggest wind farm, offshore wind farm on the entire planet. It's the biggest one in the world. And if Barrow Furness Port isn't doing what it does at the moment, then that wind farm probably wouldn't last very long. It wouldn't function the way it does. An enormous factor in the climate change policy in the area and the employment and the economy of the area is that that wind farm and its support for it through Barrow wouldn't exist if it weren't for climate change policy and the incentives that have grown up around it at the local and national scale. And of course, the largest of your employers locally in Barrow and Furness, including BAE, are themselves, to varying extents, emitters of greenhouse gases.
Just to let you know, you've got 2 minutes left.
2 minutes, no problem. The gases that most scientists would say are responsible for the kinds of climate change that we're looking at. And they will look to the council and they will take seriously local residents' perspectives on what their behaviour ought to be and how you strike the balance between a healthy economy, if indeed there is a balance to be struck here, between a healthy economy and a healthy employment landscape and the rest of the system. So what I'm trying to argue, I suppose, here is that at the local scale, you can have more influence on the politics that pertains to those kinds of hyper-local issues, that are the ones I just gave examples of. You can have more impact on the people with power. For example, the councillor is much easier for you to reach than the MP or the Prime Minister or the civil servants in Whitehall here in London. And on policy making, if you make a suggestion locally, just by sheer brute logistical sense, you're much more likely to come through with a little bit of impact than at a national or indeed an international level. And only by tackling these issues locally as individual localities and then working collectively at larger scales, once that's been done, can you start to make headway against this kind of global challenge at all. Because as we've just seen in Glasgow and we saw in Paris before that, at the international scale, some of these problems are just too hard to unpick. There are too many people facing in different directions. You never get China and America and England all wrapped up in the same direction at that scale. So here's the problem with the UK being arguably the most centralized political and economic structure in the world. Where does that leave us? It leaves us with people and processes like this one, like yours. An important and serious conversation about the way that policy should reflect what your best understanding is locally can have knock-on effects, and you can have a real chance through your recommendations to influence the tone of the conversation in other places, not just other localities that try and do a similar process to this, and they're going to be loads more like this in future, but also at the national scale as well. So you start small and you make a bigger difference along the way, and those kinds of local issues are where you can start to make a difference too. I think that probably takes me to time by my reckoning there.